Political tests need to be taken not with a grain of salt, but with a train of salt. Imagine a train with 150 cars all full of salt. Now that's a decent amount of salt you need when taking a political test. Why? Because most of the political tests are fundamentally against nuance. The more viral a test is, the more likely it is to eschew nuance. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. So, a specific political test has come once again to my attention. I had known about it from several years ago but didn't think much of it, until I saw otherwise serious and non-insane people taking the 8 values test seriously. Now, suffice to say that one shouldn't take any political test too seriously, but 8 values is particularly egregious in eschewing nuance, and it's more fitting for children than for adults. If you're older than 14, then it's a problem. So the best way to explain what I mean, well, I guess I shall now proceed to taking the test and explain step by step not only why this particular test is wrong, but why most of them are wrong. Alright, so this is the 8 values test. It's supposed to look at, well, 8 values, what one believes about equality, nation, liberty, tradition, markets, world, authority, and progress. And they are put one against the others. So, you know, more equality means less markets, more nation means less globalism, more liberty, less authority, more tradition, less progress. So right from the get-go you see this anti-nuance bias, essentially, because, you know, more tradition does not necessarily mean less progress. After all, traditionalist societies have produced most of the progress, at least in terms of, well, actually, no, most of the progress overall. I mean, not just technological, but also philosophical. I mean, at the end of the day, the Enlightenment came out of a very deeply traditional society and very deeply traditional communities and traditionalist way of thinking. So, you know, that's right from the get-go. It comes off as with anti-nuance bias, essentially. So, okay, let's go ahead and take the test, because there's quite a lot of fun in it, but also a lot of, well, more anti-nuance bias. So, let's start. We'll be okay, fair enough. Oppression by corporations is more of a concern than oppression by governments. Okay, this one is very nuanced and very on point. No, I disagree with this, largely because at the end of the day, corporations can't arrest me, corporations can't put me into jail, can't... I have yet to see a way of a situation anywhere on the planet where a corporation would run after you to try to put you down, to kill you, essentially, as a result of disagreeing with that said corporation, and that not happening at the behest of the state. So, you know, private contractors don't, private military contractors don't exactly count, because they still do the bidding for the state. They don't do it for themselves or by themselves. So strongly disagree on that one. It is necessary for the government to intervene in the economy to protect consumers. And there you go, the first anti-nuance question. Intervene in what way? And to protect the consumers from what? Because it is one thing to intervene with things like, I don't know, don't put lead in one's food, and it's a whole different thing of intervening, like, I don't know, banning certain kinds of milk because some marginal portion of the population might be intolerant to it, or banning peanuts because there are a lot of people who have peanut allergies. So it really is important, what do you mean by intervening in the economy? So, you know, mostly disagree with it. The freer the markets, the freer the people. I think that's very self-evident. Countries with deeply unfree markets tend to also be mostly the countries least free overall. So yeah, strongly agree on that. It is better to maintain a balanced budget than to ensure welfare for all citizens. Once again, an anti-nuance kind of question, because if one prioritizes welfare over balancing the budget, it only solves, quote unquote, solves the issue for a very short amount of time, because at the end of the day, someone will have to pay the debt resulted from that deficit, either through inflation, that means everyone pays it, including the poorest members of the society, or through future subsequent cuts in welfare and essentially depriving the future generations of various public services. So yes, it is better to maintain a balanced budget than to ensure welfare. Publicly funded research is more beneficial to the people than leaving it to the market. Again, which kind of publicly funded research, in what field? Because, you know, if it's military, then maybe I could agree. But if it's, you know, computers, I don't know. I wouldn't want to have the phones made by the government, or I wouldn't want, well, I wouldn't want my food to be made by the government. I've seen that movie in the past, and it doesn't work well. So, so it really does depend on what kind of research and in what field and to what extent. On the other hand, of course, the argument can come in that, you know, the grandfather of the internet, right, came out of more or less publicly funded research, right, mostly military, but also some of it made in universities with public funding. So, you know, it really does depend. If it's primary research, because there's another distinction here, primary research and commercial research. If it's primary research, almost always it is done by on public funds anyway. So there's that. I don't know. I guess I would mostly disagree with it. Tariffs on international trade are important to encourage local production. Now, this one is surprisingly nuanced, but you know, tariffs on international trade can be useful to forward various geopolitical goals. But if the goal is to encourage local production, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and even if it works, local production may be more expensive. So at the end of the day, the majority of the population still suffers, even if you have managed to encourage local production, because if you encourage it but it's expensive and therefore unaffordable, you also can't export it, so nobody really benefits. So you know, if it's strictly to encourage local production, I strongly disagree. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Now, this is the Marxist way of looking at the world, but then again, no, the study doesn't tell you that. So there's that. Yeah, strongly disagree. It would be best if social programs were abolished in favor of private charity. Okay, so this one, if you click strongly agree, you get further into the category of liberty. If you click strongly disagree, you get further in the category of well, authority and quote-unquote equality. So yeah, strongly agree. Taxes should be increased on the rich to provide for the poor. No, strongly disagree. Inheritance is a legitimate form of wealth. Again, what does legitimate mean, right? Because nobody tells you what do they mean by words. Words have meaning in a way that and have become pretty differently understood depending on who you ask. So if you ask the people who believe property is theft, then that's gonna be a problem. So you know, in these kinds of situations, it would be helpful to link to a definition. Yes, in my opinion, inheritance is a legitimate form of wealth. Basic utilities like roads and electricity should be publicly owned. Whoa, hold on a second. What does, again, it doesn't say what do they mean. I mean, like roads and electricity. Well, most roads are publicly owned anyway, but electricity is not. Oftentimes it's not. Almost always it's not. You know, and they say like these. So what others, right? Should water be publicly owned? And if yes, how much of it? Right? And what else do they call basic utilities? I mean, at this pace, at some point we're gonna find out, the internet is publicly owned. Well, how about no, right? So, strongly disagree. But then again, they don't go into what do they mean by basic utilities. These two examples aren't particularly helpful precisely because they give one that historically has been publicly owned, at least in the last 3,000 years or so, at least in what we call, well, Western civilization, Roman Empire, whatever. But electricity is a very new example and traditionally has not been owned, publicly owned. So it doesn't particularly help. But generally, no, I actually think even roads should be mostly private, and definitely electricity should not be publicly owned. Government intervention is a threat to the economy, almost always, yes. Those with a greater ability to pay should receive better health care. Now, this one is a very obvious one. Do you believe in private health care or you don't? And yes, I do believe, and no, I don't believe in equality. Quality education is a right of all people. Now, this is a difficult one. What do they mean by right? Do they mean the right to access it, or the right to receive it? Now, if it is the right to access it, yes, I don't think people should be barred from accessing quality education based on arbitrary characteristics like class or ethnicity or race or whatever. But if it's the quote-unquote right to receive it, then we get into the positive rights kind of situation. And then there I do not agree. I don't believe one has the unalienable right to get something just because one breathes, right? Because, quality education, whatever the author of the test might mean about it, quality education is still a service, and it's a pretty bloody expensive service, kind of like healthcare. So, no, strongly disagree if they mean it in a positive rights type of situation. The means of production should belong to the workers who use them. Now, this is the Marxist view of the world. No, strongly disagree. The United Nations should be abolished. Yeah, for the most part, yes. This situation, this particular question is basically put to see whether you're more globalistic or more in favor of national type of diplomacy, bilateralism versus multilateralism. And whenever you say that the United Nations should be abolished, they give you the example of the League of Nations in the past, which eventually led to the triggering of a war. But one has to remember that the United Nations today is, for the most part, a glorified debate society, and that's the best thing one can say about it. And in the rest of the time is, is a tool through which shekels for terrorist movements are being funneled. And, the United Nations Assembly, right, is usually the protect North Korea and protect all sorts of weird Asian dictatorship and Arab dictatorship, and bash the West, bash Israel and things like that. So I have yet to notice any utility, at least over the last 20 years, of the United Nations. The last time the UN intervened and had some utility was during the Albanian Civil War, but that was 24 years ago in 1997. Since then, kind of not so much. So yeah, strongly agree, it's mostly useless, and that's at best. At worst, it's actually actively harmful. If you look at UN Women, that's a highly funded vehicle to spread extremist feminism or Marxist feminism. So yeah, but that one has to go. So strongly agree. Military action by our nation is often necessary to protect it. To protect what? The nation, or the military action itself, or the might of our military, whatever that means. So, this one is a little bit hard to make sense of. But generally, yes, I agree. I mean, a country does need a military, and sometimes, yes. Now, often, what does often means? If it's once a month, then maybe it's a problem. But it also does depend on what our nation means to the reader, right, to the person that takes the test, because it's one thing to be, Iceland, which has very little reason. In fact, Iceland doesn't even have a military to begin with, but okay. So Norway, for instance, right? Norway borders Russia, but still, almost always it is rarely a situation where the Norwegian military needs military action. However, if you are, let's say, Ethiopia or Israel, or countries in terrible neighborhoods with cranky neighbors, well, in those situations, yes, military action could be necessary, oftentimes necessary. So, no, I guess I agree. I support regional unions such as the European Union. No. It is important to maintain our national sovereignty. Well, what do they mean by that? Because, sovereignty comes in degrees, right? Oftentimes there is shared sovereignty in some way, shape, or form. When a country gets into a military alliance, that country cedes some of its national sovereignty. Sometimes a lot of it, sometimes not so much of it, And sometimes that can be beneficial. See the Republic of Armenia's partially ceded sovereignty to Russia when Russia came to their defense and avoided a brutal humiliation in their recently ended war against Azerbaijan. But sometimes that can be pretty terrible. If you ask, ask Poland about Brussels trampling on its sovereignty. So it really does depend on to what degree. In principle, yes, it is important to maintain our national sovereignty, but it really does mean the devil is in the details. And this is one example of the questions that are fundamentally anti-nuance, because it really does depend on the context. But generally, yes, I agree. A united world government would be beneficial to mankind. No, first of all, it wouldn't exist, it wouldn't hold, even if you managed to create it, and definitely would not be beneficial, because it would still need to cater to the lowest common denominator, and the lowest common denominator is not a France or the United Kingdom or the or the Netherlands. The lowest common denominator is somewhere between Somalia and Eritrea. I'm just saying. So no, strongly disagree. It is more important to retain peaceful relations than to further our strength. Peace at all costs has had pretty terrible results throughout history. Mr. Chamberlain can explain quite a lot about that. But at the same time, furthering our strength at all costs has also had terrible results most of the time, although not always, but most of the time, right? So, that's a very nuanced question with not enough context. So, there's that. But generally, I disagree. Wars do not need to be justified to other countries. Again, justified in what sense? You should, at the very least, issue a declaration of war, issuing the reasons and issuing the fact that you want to get into war with someone else. But, justified in what sense? Other than that, no, I don't think, traditionally, and this will still be the case for many, many years to come, if a country goes into war, they don't ask for permission, unless it is a war triggered by an alliance and at the behest or the willingness of a smaller partner, in which case that one has to ask for permission from its colleagues in the alliance, or if it is some kind of a UN intervention or things like that. But other than that, the wars do not need to be justified to other countries. I guess I agree. Military spending is a waste of money. Yeah, that's something that only stupid would say. So but again, if it's the question is asked in a very unnuanced way. Is there such thing as wasteful military spending? Yes, of course. Is all military spending a waste of money? No. So again, a very unnuanced question, which obviously would lead to very unnuanced answers, because if we are going to get into details, yes, I'm sure we can find into the military budgets of every single country some wasteful spending, maybe quite a lot of it, maybe a lot of what would you call it, unreformed bureaucracy or unreformed apparatus. I mean, at the end of the day, the military is still in itself just another bureaucracy, right? So, but generally, no, I strongly disagree. International aid is a waste of money. Now, this one is a statement of fact. Even leftists have started to realize that, most of the money from international aid, either they end up in the pockets of deeply corrupt NGOs, such as, I don't know, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the Hillary Foundation, or things like that, or they end up into the pockets of the corrupted elite of the country allegedly receiving the aid. That's how you get a lot of African dictators being quite wealthy themselves, whilst presiding over generally pretty poor, financially poor, economically poor population. So, again, even a lot of left-wingers, including cultural icons of the left, have started to figure this one out. It's better investment, which creates jobs, is a much better way of international aid. I mean, Hans Rosling, for instance, which is a very famous was a very famous Swedish statistician, himself a deeply committed social democrat, a leftist. In his last book before he died, using statistics, he was like, I'm a leftist, but the data is clear, investment is better, and explains why opening a factory in a poor country actually helps a lot more people, and in a more equitable way indeed than sending the exact same amount of money as international aid. So yes, international aid is a waste of money, but then again, this is mostly a statement of fact at this point. My nation is great. And again, if you put strongly agree on this one, then the test will put you closer to, well, fascism. And if you put strongly disagree, then this will put you closer to, well, globalism or things like that, or progress or whatever. But then again, it really does depend, right? Because if it's someone from I don't know, Myanmar, for instance, that person might at this point strongly disagree on this test because the country is under a military dictatorship following a military coup d'etat. But that doesn't mean they necessarily think their country is not great. They just think at that moment the situation is, well, not great. So it's quite complicated. Yeah, of course, generally I agree that my country is pretty great. Maybe not the greatest, definitely not the greatest, but it's pretty good, pretty okay. Research should be conducted on an international scale. Again, it depends on what kind of research, right? Because, and what does it mean should be conducted? According to whom? Says whom? And again, what kind of research? Because if it's research on, the most recent and all over the news example, right? The research over over a treatment or vaccine for the Wuhan cough. This one was conducted on an international scale without anyone dictating it, right? But at the same time, if we're talking about military research, I don't know if it should be conducted on an international scale. I wouldn't involve China in our military research, if you don't mind. I wouldn't invite Russia in our military research, if you don't mind. So it's a lot more complicated. Or if it's research over a better car technology, is it really such a good idea to automatically assume that it should be conducted on an international scale? And why? Because at the end of the day, the company that, or the group of individuals that make that kind of research, they're making it in order not just to improve other people's lives and improve the overall idea of cars or engines, but also to make money for themselves. But if they do it in public on an international scale, then what's the point of doing it in the first place? Because research is not charity. Research is an investment, and people invest in research in order to get some profit out of it, in some way, shape or form. So generally, I disagree. But again, it's unnuanced, and that's one of the biggest problems with this test. Governments should be accountable to the international community. What does the international community means? Because this is one of those elusive phrases that appear on the news, really. What does the international community mean? Does it mean the assembly, the General Assembly of the United Nations? Sometimes it's used to mean that. Sometimes it's used to mean strategic partners. Sometimes it's used to mean regional partners. It really does depend on who you ask and when you ask. So, the international community, what does that mean? Because, if it's a country from the European Union, should it be accountable to what the South African Commonwealth has to say? And if yes, why? But at the same time, that same country, should it be accountable to the European Parliament? Well, according to the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, yes. Now, do I think that's a good idea? No, but that's how the treaties are, and the law is what it is. But it really does depend on what do you mean by international community. But generally, I disagree, unless it is a situation like Chernobyl, for instance, right, or the Wuhan cough. You have situations where the irresponsible actions of a certain government negatively impact other countries that have done nothing wrong. And in those situations, we can talk about some international accountability, but even there, it shouldn't be the international community, whatever that means. It should mean only those affected. So, in the case of Chernobyl, why should we care what Egypt thinks about this, or Eritrea, or the Central African Republic, or Australia, for that matter? They weren't affected by it. But we should care about, almost everyone bordering the USSR to the west and to the south. Yeah, those opinions should matter, because those countries were affected by the actions or inaction of of Moscow, right, of the Soviet government. So generally, strongly disagree. Even when protesting an authoritarian government, violence is not acceptable. Yeah, this is a statement of values, and at least this is, 28 questions so far. This is the first one that actually questions values. Personally, I disagree. No, I think at some point violence is acceptable. Again, one of the biggest failures of the 1989 revolution was that enough people in the streets actually believed this, namely that violence is not acceptable even though, and that was a huge failure, and it's one of the reasons why our post-communist progress was slower than it could have been. So no, personally I strongly disagree. I think at some point at least some levels of violence are acceptable, especially when it comes to authoritarian, illegitimate regimes. So strongly disagree. My religious values should be spread as much as possible. Now, what does that mean again? And what kind of values? Should my religion in particular be spread as much as possible? Or certain societal values derived from that religion? Because it's a huge difference between the two. If my religious values mean, nuclear family and the primacy of the individual, those values turned out to create very stable and very prosperous societies. And when they were spread to non-Christian or even non-Abrahamic societies, such as South Korea or Japan, who have very small Christian or Islamic communities for that matter, they turned out pretty well, whereas the societies that rejected them, such as North Korea, don't. So it really does depend on which religious values we mean. However, if that means, lapidation or things like that, probably not, right? So it really does depend, but generally I would say I agree. Our nation's values should be spread as much as possible. Well, again, which ones? All of them? If it's all of them, I disagree, because, if that is done, it could mean, it would mean essentially imperialism. But, some of them, yes. So I guess I slightly agree. It's very important to maintain law and order. Okay, this is a question of values. I personally agree, but of course it's not. The general populace makes poor decisions. Again, even if that is true, now I happen to believe it's true. I believe people are not stupid, people are fucking stupid. That's something that I live by. At the same time, though, just because that is the case, that doesn't mean that the general populace should not be listened and should not have its freedoms observed. Just because I believe they're wrong, you can still be wrong and free. And again, oftentimes there is such thing called wisdom of the crowds. So even if it may seem like a wrong decision, you may end up looking at the same situation. Hindsight is 20/20. So look at it 10 or 20 years down the line, and turns out that the decision was not exactly that wrong as it seemed at the moment when that particular decision was made. So generally, I would say, though, that I slightly disagree. It's a lot more complicated, and that's what pisses me off. And again, it also the situation is further complicated by how the person that takes the test sees the things, because one can agree with this statement, but out of the feeling that the populace's decision-making possibilities should be restricted, or one can agree with this statement the way I do, namely I think that people are not stupid, but people are fucking stupid, but they should be left alone. Whereas this test does not even register this particular nuance. The test basically increases your authoritarian score if you agree with it, regardless of the reasons, regardless of the nuance. So generally, I would say that I slightly disagree. Physician-assisted suicide should be legal. Strongly disagree. I explained about this 6 years ago. There is no control over it. Almost always you end up with legalized murder. It's no. I don't believe legalized murder should be a thing. Strongly disagree. The sacrifice of some civil liberties is necessary to protect us from acts of terrorism. I think 20 years of war on terrorism should have taught us that it's a terrible idea. Government surveillance is necessary in the modern world. Now, this is an interesting statement. What does necessary mean? I mean, it doesn't even question values. Now, you can say that it is a good thing or a bad thing. That's a statement of values. But to imply that it is necessary, now that's a different can of worms. No, I strongly disagree. Of course, it's not necessary. It's as necessary as cancer is, right? So you can say it's unavoidable. I can understand that, and I could even agree with at some level with that. But necessary, no. The very existence of the state is a threat to our liberty. Well, yes, in theory, but practicality is a little bit more complicated than that, isn't it? It's just not how this works. In theory, yes, but in practice, slightly disagree. Regardless of political opinions, it is important to side with your country. Well, again, it depends on what, right? It depends on what my country wants to do, right? I mean, if it's a leftist government that tries to spread, my country's language on another country, although I disagree with the reasons for which that leftist government would do it, I would probably side with my country. But if a left-wing government wants to install communism both here and in other countries, then no, I won't side with my country. I don't give a shit if that can create troubles. It really does depend on what are we talking about. Same thing with wars. If my country wants to go to war with one of our neighbors that is not Russia, I don't know if I would side with my country. Probably I wouldn't, really, because not all wars are created equal, and this is it is essentially a false dichotomy when people say that they're anti-war. I mean, really? Are you fundamentally anti-war? All wars are the same? No, they're not. Same thing the other way around. I guess those people would be called neocons, right? Fundamentally pro-war. Again, not all wars are created equal. Some of them are useful, some of them are not. Some of them are necessary, some of them are not. So, I guess disagree on this one. All authority should be questioned. Now, questioned, yes. Disobeyed, it really does depend on the authority, isn't it? But yeah, questioned, strongly agree. A hierarchical state is best. Okay, this one is a values question. Yes, I agree. I just happen to agree. It is important that the government follows the majority opinion, even if it's wrong. Now again, always? If it's always, I'm not sure about it. If it's, it really does depend on the issue, right? If it's an issue of various not exactly important world-shattering policies, then yes, I think the government should follow the majority opinion, even if I believe it's wrong, or even if it is objectively wrong. But if it's something very fundamental, then no, I don't think the government should follow the majority opinion. Let me give you an example. Suppose the majority of the people think that we should have every man should be wearing a hat in public. Is that wrong? Well, yeah, I believe it's wrong. I mean, I'm not a big fan of hats, but if the majority of people believe that, then yeah, the government should be following the majority opinion, even if I believe it's wrong. However, if the majority opinion would be that private property should be abolished, then no, the government should not be following the majority opinion, because that's a fundamental question, and that should not be decided at the plebiscite, right, at the ballot box, but rather should be constitutional matter, pre-settled before even having any referenda or consideration on majority or minority opinion. So I mostly agree. The stronger the leadership, the better. Again, where? In the state or generally? Because leadership is rarely a characteristic of the state anyway. Oftentimes politicians follow the trends of the general society, whether those trends are artificially created via corporate manipulation or they are genuine via various type of influencing, either through intellectuals or church or mosques. But usually the politicians are the followers. They're rarely showing leadership, really. So it depends on what level. So, a strong leadership in the church, for instance, that can be pretty helpful. Strong leadership in most, or at least certain corporations, that can be helpful. A strong leadership at the local level by the mayor or maybe even local governor could be better, could be, not always, it really does depend. But a general government with police forces, I don't know if it's a good thing, and I don't even know if it's necessarily possible. The last several decades has shown us rather the opposite, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Other people think that it is a bad thing. I don't. So it really does depend on what do they mean. So I would say unsure, and that's another problem with the anti-nuance bias, because that's why we're going through this, to show the where. And and this could have been fixed just by adding, in the state or in private affairs or in cultural affairs or in religious affairs. It really does depend on where that leadership would reside, and that would be easier to answer. So I guess unsure about it. Democracy is more than a decision-making process. Now this one is a particularly haram question, because this is a talking point that almost every faction, well, not every faction, but most of the mainstream political factions have it, right? So, for instance, those who subscribe to the European Union's definition of the rule of law, which it implies things like extremist progressive stance on homosexuals, extremely progressive stance on abortion, extremely progressive stance on the family, extremely progressive stance on a lot of cultural issues. And if you're not as extremist progressive as Brussels is, then Brussels will say that your country does not live under the rule of law. And when you ask them why, and if you tell them that, look, our country has these laws and they are rightfully observed, and they have been decided by referenda or the parliament that was legitimately elected by the people, and it's the legitimate sovereign representative thereof. And they will say, yeah, well, it has been democratic, but democracy is more than a decision-making process. So that's that. On the other hand, Eurosceptics also use this talking point when they say, yes, whatever issue at the EU level was decided by qualified majority vote, so therefore was democratic, but democracy is more than a decision-making process, and there should be subsidiarity and understanding that at the national level we disagree with these kinds of things, therefore should not apply to us, even if it has been decided via a quote-unquote democratic procedure at the Council of Ministers or the European Commission, yada yada yada. So there's that. And again, democracy is more than a decision-making process, can cut both ways. Same goes with constitutionalists in the US. They might also say the same thing, namely that yes, democracy is important, but it's more than a decision-making process because the constitutional rules matter more, and those are not subjected to democratic consensus. Therefore, we shall not debate the First Amendment, or we shall not debate the Second Amendment. So, this talking point, democracy is more than a decision-making process, can and is being used by a lot of competing factions. So, therefore, people might click strongly agree or strongly disagree for different reasons, and you don't know beforehand what will this test record as a result of clicking strongly disagree or strongly agree or neutral or disagree or whatever. So this question is probably the best example of the anti-nuance bias and the fundamentally non-nuanced or unnuanced nature of this political test. So strongly disagree because no, I think democracy is just a decision-making process, and everything else should not be put under the umbrella of democracy, but we should discuss, constitutionalism, natural law, whatever. But lumping them all together as democracies, that can lead to quite a lot of problems. So no, strongly disagree. Environmental regulations are essential. Again, how much of them? To the level of, I don't know, Egypt, or to the level of Norway, where you can't even build a proper highway because the Greens say so, or to the level of Sweden, where there's still not a ring around Stockholm because the Greens think the environment is more important than solving the pollution issue inside Stockholm. So it really does depend. What do they mean by environmental regulations? And if I say strongly disagree based on these reasons, the test might record that I disagree with any environmental regulation. Well, I generally disagree. I don't think they are essential. I think a limitation by property rather than complicated, arcane, Byzantine regulations is much better than property is a much better arbiter of these things. A better world will come from automation, science, and technology. This is not even a question of values, it's a question of magic thinking. How do you know? Maybe it could be the case, but again, a better world in what way? In all ways? If one believes that, then that's absolutely magical thinking. There is no such thing as extraordinary or fundamentally better in all aspects and with no negative. No, there is no such thing. Everything is a trade-off. And again, science, a better world will come from science, really? based on science, there is such thing as nuclear warheads. I'm just saying. Based on science, people use the radioactive toothpaste for decades. So, I wouldn't put it, again, I'm not a firm believer in scientism. I'm quite skeptical of the people who proclaim themselves to be pro-science, because, science is still done by humans, and humans are fundamentally flawed, therefore will say and do stupid things every once in a while, and by every once in a while I mean every single time. And no, I don't think that's a foregone conclusion. Same thing with technology. What kind of technology? Not all technology is created equal. Some technologies definitely bring a better world, some not really, and some have barely any influence on how the world works. So generally, though, I slightly disagree. Children should be educated in religious or traditional values. Now, this is a question of values. I happen to agree. Traditions are of no value on their own. Again, this is an interesting one, because, so what? So if I click strongly agree on this one, then the test will record a lower percentage of pro-tradition at the end of it, when it will show the results. Even though I would click strongly agree, because, well, yeah, sure, they are of no value on their own, but in the context of where they have been originating, they have a value, obviously, because if they hadn't, that tradition would have been long gone, right? So, let's say the tradition to visit your neighbor to sing carols during Easter time, right? During Good Friday, usually. Now, that tradition is of no value on its own, but in the communities that still practice it, it obviously has a value in that context, because otherwise it would have long disappeared, as it has disappeared in many Christian countries, but again, not in all. Some communities have still kept it for whatever reason, and kept it all the way to the modern era, to the current year, right? Same thing with Halloween trick or treat. It is of no value on its own, but obviously enough communities, although again not a majority, but enough communities in their context think of it as a good idea. So, just because it is of no value on its own, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is terrible. Same thing, if I click strongly disagree, the test would record a higher level of traditionalism on the result, but at the same time, just because I think just because I would think that the traditions are of some value on their own, that doesn't necessarily mean that I also believe that they should necessarily be kept. So this is the fundamentally anti-nuanced way of phrasing this test. I don't even know what to click here. I mean, I don't know. Let's put neutral. Religion should play a role in government. Okay, what role? Should the patriarch have automatic representation in the parliament? I don't know, maybe. Should religion be like in Iran, where everything has to go through a supreme religious leader? Maybe not. So, in both cases, both of these examples, religion plays a role in the government. But, the devil is in the details, as always. In the first case, it's rather a situation where religion is more like acknowledged but not decisive, and it plays a role. Whereas in the case of the Islamic Republic, is the dominant force, even though it is a minority religion in its amongst the populace that it rules over, right? So I guess I would disagree for the most part. Churches should be taxed the same way other institutions are taxed. Well, what other institutions? At least in Europe and North America, charities are not taxed. most of the think tanks, in fact all of the think tanks, are not taxed. Most of the cultural institutions, at least the non-profit ones, are not taxed. Well, the church is pretty much these three together. The church is a think tank, the church is also a charity, the church is also a cultural institution, a non-profit cultural institution. So they should be taxed the same way as other institutions. Well, which other institutions? Should it be taxed like McDonald's? McDonald's is an institution. But why? Is it in any way, shape or form similar to McDonald's? No, it's not. It's more similar with think tanks, charities, and cultural institutions. And those tend not to be taxed, and therefore the church is already taxed the same way those other similar institutions are taxed. But again, it doesn't say similar institutions. It just says other institutions. No nuance, no room for thinking. Just other institutions. Well, which ones? I guess strongly disagree. Climate change is currently one of the greatest threats to our way of life. No, it's pretty much like the other insanity that governments have been pushing and slowly no longer push it because no one believes them. But anyway, oh my God, the coronavirus has done this to the economy. No, the virus did nothing to the economy. The governments did. The governments are at fault, and that's why they should be flattened in court and at the ballot box, and yes, physically if possible. Not the virus itself. The virus did nothing wrong. Same thing here. Climate change is the greatest. No, the way the governments may or may not react to this, that's the biggest, not one of the greatest, but the greatest threat to our way of life. Climate change itself, rarely the case. Well, I guess if you're the Netherlands, then maybe it is one of the greatest threats to your way of life. But if you're not the Netherlands or some isolated island, some small island in the Pacific, generally, no, not really. Because again, if that were the case, then I wouldn't be seeing all of these propagators of the climate change narrative hurrying up to buy houses in isolated islands or on the coastlines of oceans. If they believed what they believed, if they believed what they said they believed, they would be hurrying up to get a house on top of a mountain or something, wouldn't they? Put your money where your mouth is, and that's when I'll start trusting one iota of your narrative. So no, I strongly disagree. It is important we work as a united world to combat climate change. No. Society was better many years ago than it is now. Again, better in what ways? Some things, and again, if I say strongly agree, it increases my score to traditionalism. If I say strongly disagree, it would increase my score in progressivism. But again, it doesn't have any sort of nuance. It doesn't record why I would click either strongly agree or strongly disagree, or any other option on the test. Really, was better in what way? In some ways it was definitely better, in other ways it was definitely worse. And how many years ago? Many years ago. What's that? 10 years ago? 20? 50? 150? It really does depend on when are we talking about and on what aspect. On certain aspects, it was definitely better. For instance, my favorite period over the last 50 years is probably somewhere between 1997 and 2005, 2006. I think that was much better. But that's a very subjective opinion. But again, at least that would be appropriate for this kind of questionnaire, because it would be a values question. The test is called 8 values. But just saying, society in general was better, I guess, in general, many years ago than it is now. I don't know. Maybe it was, but on what? Compared to what? Okay, compared to now, but how many years ago and on what particular aspect? Because there is no such thing as society in general. As always, there are trade-offs. So I guess I slightly agree, but it really is much more difficult than this questionnaire would admit. It is important we maintain the traditions of our past. Which ones? All of them? Okay. Yeah, okay, all of them. Strongly agree. It is important that we think in the long term beyond our lifespans. On what? On everything? Why? I mean, and how much beyond our lifespans? Because that's important. For instance, if I build a house, I should be thinking beyond my lifespan, right? Because I want, my children to use it as well. I want them to inherit it and exploit it for themselves. So I should make a house able to withstand bigger earthquakes, maybe stronger winds, and to have a reasonable expectation that it will still somewhat stand 100 years from now. But should I necessarily think of at least when it comes to a house, to withstand 1,000 years from now? That would be quite a lot of hubris, because it's just a house. Is it really that important to still be there 1,000 years from now? That's if you build a house. If I would build a church, yeah, sure, I would try to think of it maybe to still be around 1,500 years from now, because I would start from the assumption that people would still be at least liking churches 1,500 years from now, even if they might not necessarily be big fans of Christianity 1,500 years ago. But generally, what thinking in the long term beyond our lifespans, it really does depend where in one's lifespan one is when making the judgment. It also does depend on the topic at hand. So, I slightly agree, but it really does depend on the topic. On some topics it is important, on some other topics it's not really that important, and in many other topics it may be indeed detrimental. But then again, this test has a fundamentally anti-nuanced bias. Drug use should be legalized or decriminalized. Agree on the decriminalized part, not necessarily agree on legalized. It depends on the drug, and there is another nuance. If something is legal, then that means something can be taxed. But if it's only decriminalized but not legalized, then it cannot be taxed. So, and my bias is generally anti-taxes. So, fully agree on the decriminalization, not necessarily agree with legalization. But, okay, let's say agree. Same-sex marriage should be legal. Again, what does that mean? Should be recognized by the state, or legal in the sense of private contracts called marriage and recognized by private institutions, be them NGOs or even churches and whatnot, but that come with no obligation for the society at large and for the state. If it is the latter, then yes, I agree, same-sex marriage should be legal. But if it's the former, coming with obligations for the rest of the society, then I strongly disagree. I don't want any obligation towards quote-unquote legally married gay couples. No, absolutely not. I don't think their quote-unquote family is equally important or equal in any way, shape or form with a normal family. And I claim the right to believe that and act upon that belief, right? So it does depend. What does legal mean? Because if it's a situation where the state is not involved in the marriage business, then yeah, of course, the state shouldn't be legalizing, shouldn't be in the business of regulating anything. The private institutions should be. But if it's a situation, as most of the planet is, where the state regulates marriage, I would rather the same-sex situation be left out of this business. And I'm pretty sure that most of the homosexuals would agree with me. You wouldn't want the government to be a third party in your bedroom. Anyway, strongly disagree. No cultures are superior to others. That's stupid. No, that's stupid. And this kind of belief can only come from people who have not been anywhere outside Europe and North America. Even the most globalistic, egalitarian people that I know, even they started to question their beliefs upon visiting a few countries in Asia and a few countries in Africa. And the more you travel, the less likely you are to believe this kind of disdainful nonsense. No, obviously some cultures are superior to others. No, the cultures are not fundamentally equal. They're fundamentally unequal, and that's great. Shouldn't, I thought diversity is a strength. Now suddenly it isn't. So no, strongly disagree on this one. But at least this one is a question of values. Sex outside the marriage is immoral. Again, what does marriage mean? Do we mean marriage in a biblical sense, where it is a publicly communicated arrangement towards one's local community, or do it mean marriage in the sense of taking that commitment to the state as it is understood today? Because if it's in the biblical sense, I agree. If it is in the sense of getting a, what do you call it in English, marriage license, I strongly disagree. None of the business of the government whom one is having sex with whom, right? So it really does depend. I guess I agree, but it really does depend. If we accept migrants at all, it is important that they assimilate into our culture. This is a statement of value indeed. I happen to agree with it, but you know, globalists obviously don't. Abortion should be prohibited in most cases, most or all cases. Okay, that's a bit extreme. But again, it depends on where you're looking at. If you're looking, you know, have you noticed that the pro-life movement is much more radical in the US than it is in Europe? And that's because in Europe, it's a very difficult case to be, it's very difficult to make a very hard-line pro-life case because, well, abortion is pretty strictly regulated in Europe. And that's a good thing. But in the US, the entire debate was not permitted in the first place, and the decision just handed down through the lawsuit Roe v. Wade, which was wrongly decided anyway from a constitutional perspective. And you also have very extreme places like New York, where abortion is essentially limitless. The permission is limitless. You can legally have an abortion in the 9th month. And I'm sorry, but that's just murder. So, you know, someone from the United States who has a pro-life bias would say strongly agree on this one, because from the perspective of his own country, the situation is so extreme in the other direction, but that it has to be countered by a more hardline stance. Whereas someone looking from, well, from Romania, like me, knowing the situation of the 770th decree that was in force until 1989, I'm a bit skeptical of these kinds of radical claims, because this one has been tried in the past and it wasn't particularly nice. So, you know, slight disagree. Again, a more nuanced proposition would have been in order. Gun ownership should be prohibited for those without a valid reason. This is a statement coming straight from a Eurocrat, essentially. You know, EU bureaucrats talk like that, because again, the assumption is that the government gets to decide what a valid reason is, whereas I would come from the understanding that it's none of your business what my reason is. If I want it, that's a valid reason enough. So yeah, no, of course, strongly disagree. I support single-payer universal health care. Again, especially now with the situation of the Wuhan cough, the limits and the extremism of single-payer universal health care is shown in public for all to see. I mean, you know, British people watching this, do you enjoy the sanitary fascism in your country? Remember, it is imposed to save the NHS. How does that make any sense? Well, that's single-payer universal health care for you. And if you look in Europe, with the countries that had least hysterical reactions to the Wuhan cough, there's a surprisingly strong correlation with the presence of private healthcare on the market. The more private healthcare is on the market, or at least non-regulated, the better. The least the extreme the reaction is. So no, I don't support. I think single-payer universal healthcare is absolute and unadulterated cancer and a fundamental harm towards not just the economic health of a nation, but the physical health of a nation. So no, strongly disagree. Prostitution should be illegal. Nah, leave prostitutes alone. Maintaining family values is essential. Again, what does that mean? Whose family values? Family values as, well, as in Italy, or family values as in Germany? or family values as in Russia, or family values as in Saudi Arabia. It really does depend. And also, not just on a cultural level, but also on the individual level. Some families have values that are absolutely cancer. Should the values of those families be maintained? And if yes, is that necessarily essential? Well, it depends on who you ask. There are a lot of nuances that are missing from this particular test. So, I don't know. I generally agree, but it's a lot more complicated. To chase progress at all costs is dangerous. Yes. Genetic modification is a force for good even on humans. All cases, no exceptions, no nuance. I don't know. Again, in these kinds of situations, the fundamentally scientific and conservative value of first do no harm should be more important than belief, make believe, essential, that it's a force for good. No, I disagree. We should open our borders to immigration. Any sort of it. Again, what kind of it? All of it? Unfiltered? So if I click agree here, it might increase my globalism score, even if I think that, and again, it does depend on compared to what. Most countries in the world are relatively open to immigration, but not all of them are completely open, like the United States tends to be. Most of the countries are slightly more restricted than that, going to such extreme length as North Korea, and going all the way to, kind of like most EU countries, where you can legally get in, but it's not a free-for-all, and it's definitely not a free lunch. So coming from such a country, I would say it's already quite open enough. Disagree. Governments should be as concerned about foreigners as they are about their own citizens. So this essentially says foreigners should be treated as equally important as its own citizens. Now this is stupid. Do foreigners pay equal tax with the citizens? Oftentimes no. And the very idea of citizenship means that there is a fundamental contract between the individual and the state that comes with certain rights and privileges and obligations. Yes, privileges. Don't like it? Tough. No, strongly disagree. No, governments should prioritize their own citizens over foreigners. Always. No ifs and buts. All people, regardless of factors like culture or sexuality, should be treated equally. All the time? Really? No. No, not all the time. This is a question of values again, but not all the time. No. No, really, no. Taking this to the extreme, you get to the situations of so-called transgender athletes beating the living crap out of women. That would be treated equally, but that's equally terrible. So I disagree. It is important that we further my group's goals above all others. Now, this one is, the last question and the most cancerous of them. What does my groups means? Does it mean my ethnic group? Does it mean, well, my racial group? That would be terrible. That would be complicated because, in Southeastern Europe, we're kind of the most mixed populations. There is a little bit of Arab, there is a little bit of Turkish, there is a little bit of, Northern European, there is a little bit of German. So, we're a pretty mixed bunch here, historically speaking. So, my racial group would be quite a complicated situation. Then, but again, every single individual is part of multiple groups. So, is it my ethnic group? Is it my sex group? Men should be, men's goals should be furthered above all others. I don't know, maybe. Or, smaller groups, like I happen to be an atheist. Do the goals of atheists should be furthered above all others? Probably not. Quite frankly, most atheists have terrible values, so I would say no. I also happen to be, a listener of black metal and thrash metal. Should the goals of thrash metal listeners be furthered above all others? And if yes, why? I also happen to be a smoker, right, of cigarettes, of tobacco. Should the goals of tobacco smokers be furthered above all others all the time? Is that even a thing? I also happen to be, I don't know, a listener of classical music, especially 17th century classical music. Should the goals of listeners of 17th century classical music be furthered above all others? But why? I also happen to be somewhere between somewhat of a conservative, somewhat of a libertarian. Should the goals of my of the group of people with similar political beliefs as mine be furthered above all others? Maybe. I would like that, but is that an absolute desire? Maybe not. Maybe not, because I'm not a totalitarian. So it really does depend on what do they mean by my group's goals. And there are other situations. I could even go. Let's take the globalist stance. I'm a citizen of Europe. The citizens of Europe are a group. Should the interests of my group, in this situation, the citizens of Europe, be furthered above all others? Well, if you ask me, the answer is no. But if you ask the EU's apparatchiks, they will answer yes, even though they declare themselves as anti-imperialists and egalitarians. So it's a lot more complicated. Generally, I would say I disagree, but slight disagree, not strong disagree, because it really does depend on which group are we talking about. Alrighty, so there you go. Even though I mentioned a lot of nuance about war, according to this test, I'm a neocon. Hog. So yeah, there you go. Almost 90% capitalist, 81.7% nationalist, civil axis moderate, slight authoritarian but mostly moderate, which is interesting. I have no idea how this was calculated. Mostly traditional, screw progress. Okay, this one fits. Yeah, there you go. That's basically the test. The results themselves also show how inaccurate the outcome can be, because if you look exclusively on this one, it would probably mean that this channel doesn't exist, right? I make videos and I hold conferences and classes on a lot of global issues and how to treat them locally, and how to create political parties, how to create institutions on multiple countries. If I were 82% nationalist, I would stop doing all of that, because why do I care about other countries? So there you go, the anti-nuance situation. The only portion where it's definitely accurate is on economics. Yes, I guess I'm 90% capitalistic. Probably even there it's probably slightly inaccurate, because if I were to rate myself, I would put myself on 94% capitalistic. Same thing with the civil axis. I would probably put myself as 50-50, 50 liberty, 50 authority, rather than the way it came out. And on tradition, again, if you remember how I asked or how I phrased things, it's probably this test puts me at more traditional than I probably am. But the way the questions are phrased are so anti-nuance, and that's why these kinds of tests, these kinds of political tests, are, well, more appropriate for kids really than for adults. So yeah, that will be pretty much it with this test. I hope I've made my point about nuances. Let me know what you think, and with all of that being said, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, visit our website, and I'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.